planners. Ethan Begley is a product consultant for Exapta Solutions, and he will be the main presenter. Ethan was first a customer for Exapta and saw immediate results and success from our products and just our philosophy on no-till seeding, and he wanted to come on board and help consult with other farmers of how to help them be more successful in their operation. Dale Nuss and I both started in 2013 at Exapta Solutions, and Dale worked for an AGCO dealership for many years, and then I talked him into coming on full-time with Exapta, and he is a great addition to our team with all the skills equipped to help farmers as well become more successful on their operation. And he always puts the customer first. And myself, Leah Laney, I'm the Chief of Operations Sales Manager at Exapta, and I had the privilege to work alongside Matt Hagney for 6.5 years. He was an exceptional teacher and has taught and equipped all three of us, myself, Dale, and Ethan, to carry on, to push Exapta forward and to share the expertise and guidance and all the skills that we can pass on to farmers to help them be more successful. So this presentation is compiled with all the information that Matt had gathered for 25 plus years of his study and devotion to no-till seeding, and along with Dale and Ethan and I's additions. So with that, last thing, we mainly will be addressing John Deere, Kinsey, and White planters. Case customers, I'm sorry, but your planter is probably as good as it's going to get. We just don't have a lot of additions to add to the case planters. So, and we will only be addressing double disc openers. We will not be covering anything that has to, well, specifically anything with drills, air drills, or box drills. So with that, Ethan, if you want to take over from here and kickstart the presentation.
All right. Yes, thanks, Leah. Yeah, just getting started. We really just wanted to do this kind of as a refresher, whether you're already in the field or you're still going through your planter, just some things to look for, what to pay attention to, and why things are the way they are with the planters today, and kind of what you can do to achieve a little bit more success, not only just in a no-till environment, but just trying to get the maximum use out of your planter. And that's kind of what we're trying to accomplish. You know, you're looking for an even stand, better emergence, that all translates to more potential at the end of the season for a higher yield. And that's where the return on investment really adds up. So that's really what we're trying to accomplish and why we wanted to put this on. Exapta, we have it kind of broken down into 4 main steps. This is a simplified version of it. We'll get into more detail as we go through the presentation, but it's basically you have to cut the residue, place the seed into the furrow, firm the seed at the seed's location just where it's needed, and then close the furrow by chopping the sidewall and allowing good airflow into the furrow. First things first, though, you can add all the attachments, accessories you want on the planter. If the planter is not running level or slightly nose up, the geometry of the row units will be thrown off and nothing will be really working like it should. And that's important to know. We see this way too often. Planter is running nose down, and so the row units are kind of tipped forward. And that's not a good thing. You're definitely trying to avoid that. You can see in the picture here, you can see this line of the terrain, and then maybe, you know, he's got a line here on the row marker arms. That's an easy one to look at. You can see it's just tipped back for 90 degrees just a little bit, and that's what you're looking for. That gives you more pressure on the row units, more pressure on the closing wheels. It just makes everything work a lot better. So definitely make sure that you're running level or nose up in the field. Most important thing to start with. And this just further hits on those points. Ignore the parallel linkage. That can be deceptive. It doesn't always have to be level, and it's really hard to tell just by looking at that. I mentioned the row marker arms. You have to be a little bit far away to actually judge the terrain and see what is level if you're not on a level surface already. And we encourage you to level the planer before you even start planting in the season. That should be some of your preseason checks once you have the planer hooked up. And like I said, the problems with not being nose up or in a nose down position, it affects the seed tube angle. The seed tube is more of a flatter angle, so it's shooting seeds more parallel to the soil. It's shooting them back a little bit, whereas you want more of a straight up and down, so the seeds are kind of tucked in closer to the blades. It's less pressure you can put on the Keaton, less pressure on the closing wheels. It actually creates more of a toe in on the closing wheels, and we're trying to achieve a toe out. And then also definitely affects the downforce you're going to put on the row unit. No matter how much pressure you think you're getting, if you're in a nose down position, it's probably not what the manual is telling you are.
And Ethan, I'll just step in to emphasize this step, the planer running level to nose up. It seems very simple, but time and time again, we'll go visit customers out in the field and their planer is running nose down. So it's probably one of the most common steps or settings that gets overlooked. So we just want to emphasize the importance because as Ethan shared, it literally affects everything.
So step one, the first thing you have to do is cut the furrow to a consistent depth. There's a number of ways to do this, but it definitely starts with sharp opener blades. You have to have a heavy enough planer to put enough down pressure on the row units to push those blades into the soil. And there's other ways to kind of clear the residue or make sure you're cutting through it, and we'll address those also. But it's definitely making sure that those blades will go to the depth you think you're going, the depth you want them to go. So sharp opener blades, the standard opener blade on most planers is 15 inches in diameter. We tell you to replace those at 14 and 5/8. If you're letting it get less than that, the bevel's usually gone. Most of your cutting power is not there anymore. It's not as sharp. It takes more down pressure to force a dull blade into the ground. And keep in mind too that there's still 3 millimeter blades out there, and they have a lot of blade flex, which will address that problem also. But the 3.5 millimeters seems to be the sweet spot as far as the width of the blade. I know a lot of the new planters now, they have 4 millimeter blades. We just from some of the tests we've seen, it's just more opener blade to force in the ground than's really necessary. I mean, you get a little less blade flex, but at the same time, it takes quite a bit more pressure to force that extra 0.5 millimeter into the ground. It's really 1 millimeter after you have 2 blades. So just be aware of that. I'm not saying it's a problem, but it's definitely a little more involved when you go to the 4 millimeters. Shimming, we get this question a lot also. Inch to 1.5 inches is really all you need. You're just looking for some contact at the front. Once the blades go in the soil, they're going to flex together anyway. So there's no need to have like a 2 to 2.5 inches of contact. That's really just extra pressure on those bearings that's just not needed. And you can see in the picture here, we've got the Forges to No blade we're currently selling for planters. And it's basically just comparing the bevel size. You can see the OEM blade down there too. Most OEMs that we find seem to have like a 5/8 bevel, and whereas the Forges to No is closer to a 3/4, and that just a little bit longer lasting, it's going to stay sharper a little longer, and that's kind of what we're after. And then it has the picture of the worn blade there, and that's definitely time to replace. You can't really see a bevel left. There's no cutting edge there anymore. And just to make you aware of the differences there.
In addition to the things that Ethan pointed out, the picture on the right, the no bevel blade, that is an aftermarket blade that has less than 2 seasons of use on it. So I want to share and point out the fact, just because you put new blades on your planter last year does not necessarily mean they're in good shape and ready to go this year. There's a lot of variation in the quality and the consistency of the wear life of aftermarket blades.
So I mentioned the weight on the planter. So that's used to leverage the downforce you're putting on the springs or airbags or hydraulic downforce, whatever you're using. If you don't have enough weight on the planter frame itself, you're not going to be getting the proper down pressure on the row unit. And that's something else that's quite common. I know Matt mentioned that quite a few times, that especially in no-till where you have a lot more soil structure to push through, you need adequate weight on the planter. And that's something to be aware of, especially if it's a tougher condition and you're trying to max out the pressure. Most likely you probably don't have enough frame weight in the first place. So just be aware of that. Check that in the field. If you're setting it your depth to where you want it and it doesn't look like it's achieving that, most likely a little more frame weight would help you in that situation. So other ways to cut through the residue, it's very popular in the past to have a no-till coulter on the front. We continue to see it on new planters, even coming from the factory. The coulters, we encourage you to run those as shallow as possible. It just does too much disturbance ahead of those opener blades. That's really not needed. They create little fissures in the soil where the seed can kind of slip underneath, and that affects its emergence. If it's wet underneath, it's just going to pull up some of those wet clumps, and that just gets in the way of the openers, and it doesn't cut properly and can gum up the planter easier. And then, of course, if you have another opener blade that you're trying to force into the soil, you're robbing downforce that you need for the actual double disc openers themselves. So just be aware that it definitely takes a little more force to force in that extra one, and that's not going to help you when you're trying to force two blades in the soil a little further back, and that's where you want all of your pressure. This guy's got it right here. You really don't get any better than this as far as running them shallow, and that's really what we're looking for.
And in addition to those things, let's take a moment and think about the coulters and why they were offered. The history on the coulters goes back almost 50 years now, to the early 70s. Alice Chalmers was one of the early pioneers in no-till planting, and at that time they felt they needed a coulter to cut residue, but that was also ahead of a row unit that by today's standards had very little down pressure. So they may have been needed 50 years ago, but we feel that the coulters are only needed on those planters that were made way back when.
Yep, and just sometimes you even hear that they take a little pressure off the opener blades as far as the cutting, but if you keep your blade sharp, I mean, you should not have any problem cutting through residue. And if you continue to have a problem cutting through residue, even with sharp opener blades, you know, sometimes in the mornings or in the evening when the dew's on, it can be hard to really cut through some of that. That's where the row cleaners come in. It's the problem with row cleaners that we see is just the fact that a lot of times they're not run correctly. So you're only trying to move about half the residue out of the way with the row cleaners, no more than that. And if you're doing more than that, you're probably doing more, looks more like a strip till situation where you're clearing more of a clear strip. You're almost even furrowing out, moving some of the soil. And that's not a good situation. That, a water can pond into the furrow. Weeds, you're just opening that soil up to sunlight and more weeds can grow. It's just not something that needs to be done. So with a row cleaner, you can see in this picture here, these two strips down the middle, that is where the row cleaners have ran. The rest of the planter did not have any. That's kind of what we're saying. You're only moving half the residue, just enough so those opener blades are taking off some of the pressure of cutting through that whole mat of residue. And that definitely helps your seed soil contact, just because they're doing a little bit of little bit of extra work to make sure those blades are penetrating the soil and not hairpinning. So step 2, place the seed consistently to the bottom of the furrow. And there again, it comes back to the planter must be level. You have to have a well-defined sidewall and a furrow of proper width to make sure that the seed is actually reaching the bottom. And this illustration really helps to hit home the levelness of the planter. You can see they have the seed tube highlighted here. If you can envision, so if this planter grow unit was tipped up a little bit, that would change the trajectory of these seeds so they are shooting more of a parallel angle with that soil, and they're shooting farther back. So as these blades lift out of the soil, they're bringing some soil with it, and the gauge wheels are there to keep that soil in place, but it still happens, there's still soil that can fall in there ahead of the seed. And so if you envision some soil falling in ahead, that seed could be at a little higher depth than what the rest of them can be. So you have erratic depth. And that's what causes problems with uneven emergence. So that's why when you tip the planter back a little bit, so it's running nose up, so you have kind of a 2 degrees, nose up would be good. It's not perfectly level, but the seed tube is more at a straight angle then. And that helps the seed to be thrown closer to where the blades are before the soil has a chance to get in ahead of the seed. And one thing to note too, I know the latest planters with the high-speed tubes, John Deere's got the brush belt or precision speed tube, they are more of a straight angle, and that definitely helps. They're throwing the seed out a little farther forward than just the regular seed tube, and that's another benefit of having that. So just keep that in mind if you're looking at those. And I know a lot of people even have them. They don't necessarily use them for high speed. It's just because it's a little more accurate spacing, and it also allows you to have a more straight angle on your seed tube. A well-defined sidewall, this is very important, and a lot of people don't realize that the gauge wheels is actually what creates the sidewall that guides the seed to the bottom of the furrow. So if you think about it, when you set the gauge wheels, you want them to be rubbing against the blade. You want contact there. You really don't want any space between the gauge wheel and the opener blade. And that's why it's important to make sure that your gauge wheel arm does not have any slop. There's no wear in those bushings, because that can affect the out of round on the gauge wheel. So if you get some space between the gauge wheel and the opener blade, that allows soil not only to fall into the furrow, but it allows soil to, if it's a muddier situation especially, you can get mud into the gauge wheel. If you're not running a spoke gauge wheel like the Mudsmith, it just gums up a lot quicker. So that's why it's important to make sure you're getting rid of the slop in the gauge wheel arm, and also to set the gauge wheel so they are lightly rubbing against the blades. That will keep all dirt firm pressure on that furrow, so that you're not having the soil falling before the seed, as I mentioned. We'll address the RID gauge wheels in a little later, and as it hits on there, the sidewall blowout is more of a problem than most people realize, and we see it quite often. And it all revolves around adequate downforce on the row unit. So this is just a diagram to show you kind of, if you have a little bit of lifting, if you allow some of that soil to come up around the gauge wheels, it can fall in right here by the opener blade. But not only that, same thing with the coulter when I was talking about the little fissures. When you have little fissures like this, especially in a high clay soil, the seed can tuck into those fissures, and then it has to grow sideways and then upward to kind of get around that. And that's not an ideal situation for even emergence. And that's one of the reasons why we encourage no coulters, and to make sure your gauge wheels have firm pressure. Unit mounted fertilizer openers. This is another one, kind of the same idea. It's a lot of disturbance close to the furrow. So we encourage you to have them at least 4 inches away, so you're not getting in the way of proper furrow placement. And you can kind of see in the picture, this is probably 2 inches away, which is the most common, but you can see how it might be causing some fissures, some extra disturbance on one blade versus another. That can affect your blade life, the bearing life on one blade, because it's different cutting angles. One side's easier to cut through than the other. And this helps illustrate that a little better. You can see when you're more of 4 inches away, there's no chance of really affecting the furrow, the openers, whereas like 2 inches away, there's definitely a chance there to affect that. So there's different ways around that. You can have frame mounted openers, but it's still kind of the same idea. It's before the openers go through. Excuse me. So we'd encourage you to kind of put fertilizer on behind the opener blades. I mean, there's different 2x2 openers now that allow that. Or like we said, 4 inches away, if you go with a frame mounted opener blade or fertilizer opener, excuse me, that really helps to minimize those problems. And furrow of proper width, this is also important. If you're, the C-tube guard is what's important to make sure that it's not getting worn too thin, because if it's worn too thin, you'll have a very narrow V. And as you can see here, this seat is not reaching the bottom. There's an air pocket underneath there. You're looking for more of a flat bottom furrow, and what helps that is the C-tube guard. When the blades go in the ground, they will flex together from the pressure of the soil. And the only thing keeping them from going too close together is a C-tube guard that's up to spec. Brand new, the C-tube guards are 15/16 wide, and we tell you to replace them at about 11/16. If you let them get less than that, usually you'll start to see them get into the C-tubes. It'll wear on the shank a little bit, and it just causes a little more problems. So we try to avoid having a narrow pinch furrow as you see here. And one other thing to mention too, we want the blades to form the furrow. There are other manufacturers that have C-tube guards that sit below the blades, and they actually do the furrow forming. We encourage to stay away from those because they do too much smearing of the sidewalls. If you have the blades forming the furrow, there's really no smearing there other than what the blades do, and that's what we encourage. The guard is just there to protect the C-tube and keep the blades from flexing too close together.
And so on this slide, we're wanting to show you the difference of our Valiant, Exapta's Valiant C-tube guard compared to the factory OEM C-tube guard. Why is the Valiant better? First of all, it's made out of the chrome alloy, and so it will wear about 3 to 4 times longer than your factory OEM guard. These two photos were the far left and the middle photo was submitted to us from a customer that farms in Nebraska. The far left photo is guards that go on a John Deere planter, and that went over 2,000 acres on a 24-row planter. And you'll see the factory guard measures 5/8 of an inch. And that was up after 2,000 acres. So even before he finished, probably halfway through, he was already experiencing tremendous blade flex and too much of a V-shaped trench to where he was seeing inconsistent seed depth. The middle photo is for a Kinsey 3000 series planter, and you can see here that the OEM guards two of them measure a 1/2 inch. I mean, that's way past the completely worn out stage of the guard. So on a 16-row planter going over 500 acres on that Kinsey 3000 series, it's just, I can't stress enough how important it is to keep your Valiant or your C-tube guard up to par. The Valiant, I don't want to make it an infomercial, but the Valiant will get you through the season, if not 2 or 3. And
Yep.
Ethan, I do want to, one last thing is that the last day of planting is just as important as the first day. So another reason to keep your guard up to par that's going to last you the entire season, not just the first day. We want to finish strong.
Yep, and then also just to hit on that right picture there with the tape measure, that's approximately where we're asking you to measure for these widths. The bottom rear, that's the key point. That's where the blades will be rubbing the most. And that width is what we're going by. If it gets too narrow, that's how the blades can flex too much. So this is a video from Don. It just better illustrates like I was saying with the gauge wheel pressure. You can see here the seed's falling down, but there's still quite a bit of residue and soil falling in almost before the seed's even reaching the bottom. And that's kind of what I'm describing by having enough pressure on the gauge wheels. And you can also see the seed tube guard there and the end of the seed tube, and that's keeping those blades from flexing too close at the rear, and that's what's giving this well-defined furrow. And that's what we're saying by the gauge wheel position, making sure that the gauge wheels are far enough rear against the blades to keep any of this soil from falling in, because there's quite a bit of gap. The only thing that's guiding these seeds to the bottom of the furrow is the furrow walls, and that's why it's so important to have those completely intact until the seed reaches the bottom. And just like I said, with the seed tube guard and everything, this is the perfect illustration to give you a better idea of what we're talking about. So by having a seed tube guard that's up to spec, you should make sure that you check your seed tubes. Seed tube cracking or chipping on the bottom is also something that's common. But what we're saying also, if your seed tube guards are getting checked quite often, you shouldn't have to worry about this as much. Your seed tubes should stay in a much better condition if you're keeping your guards from getting too narrow. The bullseye seed tubes here, they actually have a tungsten carbide tip because that's usually where the wear is. And that just helps to give it more life because that's usually what wears out first on a seed tube. So we just encourage you to check your tubes, make sure they're in good condition. This will affect not only your spacing, but it can affect emergence too, just by delaying the drop on the seeds if they hit a crack. So just be aware of that. Step 3 is firm the seed by applying consistent pressure exactly where it's needed. So you want to firm the seed into the bottom of the furrow. And what we're doing with that so far is with a Keaton seed firmer and our Mojo wire. The Keaton firmer, like I said, is a tail that pushes the seed into the bottom of the furrow. We're adding the Mojo wire to make sure that it has enough pressure to do that. What we found is that even straight from the factory, the Keatons, they flex a lot. Like there's really not much pressure on them. Especially in a no-till situation, it takes quite a bit more pressure than people realize to push that seed into the bottom of the furrow. And that's where it comes in with the Mojo wire. You're looking for more even emergence. So making sure each seed has the seed-to-soil contact you're looking for really helps that. And that's where the firmer comes in. That's where the Mojo wire, putting enough pressure to force that into the ground, really adds up. And as you can see here, this is a perfect illustration. This seed is just laying in the furrow, and you're completely relying on Mother Nature to give you some rain, get some moisture down there for that seed. Or you would have to do an inordinate amount of packing from the top down with your closing wheels to make sure there's no air pockets and to make sure that seed is fully covered with soil so it's going to get the moisture it needs. We're not trying to rely on that. We really don't need to do that much packing from the top. If you're firming that seed at that seed's point, it's going to look more like this. You can see the seed here. It's firmly embedded in the soil. It's mostly covered with soil, and it's going to get all the moisture it needs. There should be no problem with emergence on this seed. even if you don't do a perfect job of closing that soil, it should still have a good emergence. It should still come up because there's no shortage of moisture here and it's firmly embedded in the soil. This seed was planted no-till with Thompson wheels, and you can see how they've already brushed away the soil on top. It's really nice and loose. This is an ideal environment for that seed to pop right through. And this is kind of more what we're talking about. Uniform emergence, every seed's firmed at the same depth, and we just can't emphasize the firming enough. That's what we feel like is the most important piece. You know, you can have poor opener blades, and the seed tube guard may not be up to perfect spec, but by coming through and pushing each seed into the soil, you're increasing your odds of a better stand a lot. Like it makes a major difference, and that's what we feel like a lot of planters are missing. And just some myths on the Ketons. You know, you hear a lot of times where they will drag the seed. A lot of times that's mainly because of not enough pressure, and that's where the Mojo wire really helps that. And even mud buildup as well. By keeping that firmer firmly embedded into the bottom of the furrow, any mud that would accumulate will scrape off on the sidewall, and that definitely helps to keep those things clean. And this is just another study documenting, you know, every plant that's late in emergence, it basically turns into a weed. It doesn't ever turn out to yield equal to if you had proper emergence from the beginning. And it translates at the end of the season to quite a bit of a loss. And that's why we emphasize the firming step so much.
This is one of the pictures that I really enjoy and like to show and share. In fact, the one on the left, I use it as a screensaver on my computer as a constant reminder. When we're on the phone with customers or taking questions at farm shows, one of the common questions is Ketons and Mojo wires. It's a hot topic. What we're wanting to show here and emphasize is the two pictures in the center and on the left are Ketons with Mojo wires, and obviously in very muddy conditions. And those Ketons are clean and doing their job, pressing that seed down when the planter is obviously running in some less than ideal conditions. The picture on the right is the picture of a Keton without a Mojo wire running in some very nice conditions. And even in those nice conditions, we're seeing some soil buildup. Probably in this scenario or on this particular field, it was not causing an issue, but it just shows it's a very clear picture of the difference that the Mojo wire will make on mud buildup to the Keton. And again, we just can't overemphasize the importance of Ketons and firming the seed with the Mojo wire.
And then just to address the question when to replace Ketons. So you can see in the left picture here, you've got a worn out Keton next to a brand new one. Usually what happens first is they'll get too narrow. And this one on the left, it's quite a bit narrower. From new, they usually have a little bit more of a flat bottom. They're more of a U shape, whereas after they wear, they conform to the furrow and they start to form a V. And if you get too narrow, the seeds can slip past there and not every seed gets firmed. And that's what we're trying to avoid. And then the picture on the right, that's a brand new tail, little over 2 inches deep. We would encourage you that if you're not really forming a V, but you're at that 1 inch off of that, we would replace it. If it gets any more than that, if it's less than 1 inch deep, you're probably going to start cutting into liquid tubes. So just those are two key areas you can look at when you're deciding what to replace. Step 4 is closing the furrow. And what we're trying to do is you're just basically chopping up the sidewall and pulling some loose dirt over the top of the seed. You already have your seed to soil contact with the Keton firmer, so there's no need to do a lot of high pressure over the top of the seed, a lot of packing. You're trying to just get that sidewall chopped up is the main goal, and what we're accomplishing with a spoke closing wheel. And when you're setting your wheels, just keep in mind also, we're looking for around 2 inches of space at the closest point between the two wheels. That really helps to optimize the sidewall breakage and to make sure that they're not running too close, but that seems to be kind of the sweet spot. So the wheels from the factory, they come standard with rubber tire closing wheels. Why would you even want to change those in the first place? And we encourage you to look at the spiked wheel just because it's doing more fracturing of that sidewall, and that can definitely hinder not only the seed's growth, but it can just hinder moisture and the rooting ability. We encourage oxygen exchange by, when you crumble that sidewall, you're getting oxygen to the seed. Your seedling has an easier path to the surface, and their soil can warm up a little faster when you're actually doing crumbling and lightly covering that seed. You're not packing everything from the top down like the rubber wheel would do. You usually have to have a tremendous amount of pressure on those rubber wheels to get that furrow closed and get all the air pockets out. And that's the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish. And like I mentioned, you should shatter both sidewalls of the furrow, and you need to adequately break those down. 3/4 of that furrow should be broken up. You want to get close to seed depth, not all the way down to the seed, but you definitely want to be aggressive in getting that fracture. That way those crown roots can go through both sides and proliferate through that whole soil profile and get the nutrients and the water that they need. You're not looking, when the sidewalls are overpacked, that would be called a rootless or a tomahawk root, and they'll only grow with the furrow and you won't see as much rooting into the sidewalls. And that's what we're trying to avoid.
In addition to what Ethan just said, I just also would like to point out that in that last slide, that's also a good place to look at how the half and half closing wheel setups that in some areas seem to be very popular would show how they could work against you, because you would have crumbling on one side of the sidewall like you want, but the solid wheel would then be actually packing or adding even more compaction to the side that it's running on, and again, potentially causing that tomahawk root condition that we're referring to.
Yep. And this picture helps illustrate that a little more. You can see those big chunks of sidewall there and this very spindly plant. That's probably, that's some pretty good sidewall compaction there that wasn't adequately crumbled. And that's kind of what he's saying with, even running a rubber on one side. You've got sidewalls on both sides, and you want the roots to go through both sides of the furrow. So there's no use in trying to still pack one side. You might as well use a spoked wheel on both sides, so you're adequately crumbling the whole sidewall, the whole area around that seed. That way those roots can really grow. And this is a little more helpful as far as what to look for. You can see around the seed there at the bottom of the tape measure, there's a little bit of sidewall left there, but everything above it, it's pretty well fractured. They've cleared that away there. They're trying to find the seed, but it's nice and loose above there, and there's really no chunks of sidewall left. And that way those roots can really grow through that. And that's what you're looking for. And this just hits further on the point. You have to run enough tension on the closing spring to make sure that you're getting down deep enough, a little bit above the seed. Make sure you're disrupting both sidewalls and not overpacking it. And then the toe out wedges, this is something that Exapta has done for a number of years. You're starting to see a few more companies catching on that when you angle the wheels outward at the front a little bit, it really helps to make those wheels work better. If you look at this diagram, you can envision the opener blades pulling the soil in both directions to one side. And by using the closing wheels and towing them out at the front, you're doing the opposite of the opener blades, and you're pulling that soil back together and crumbling it up as it's covering that furrow. And that's what we're trying to achieve with the toe out wedge. And you can adjust it. You can go up to 6 degrees. and it just really helps if you're having problems closing your furrows. This can make all the difference, and we'd encourage you to consider that if you are having problems and you're not satisfied with how your spoke closing wheels are doing.
And Ethan, I'll add a little bit more on the toe out wedge, just with adjustments. We had a question about how to adjust the toe out wedge, and typically we would say if you're north of I-70, we would recommend to rotate the toe out wedge at 45 degrees, where the outline is blue and not in the demonstration there. And if you're south of I-70, you could go at the horizontal max toe out. And that's with the thicker part of the wedge pointing towards the tractor. And then on the next slide, so here is an illustration that we're providing for you to provide a visual of what you really want to look for when you're looking for a spoke closing wheel. In no-till conditions or no-till seating, a spoke closing wheel, any spoke closing wheel is going to be better than the smooth OEM wheel. Now, we are well aware that the market is flooded with all kinds of different closing wheels. Any way you look, there's a closing wheel. So at the time when this illustration was put together, the top photo there is a smooth OEM wheel. The second one is very similar to like the Dawn curve in time. The third one is the spiked, very similar to the Martin. And the bottom one, very bottom one, is very similar to the Martin 20-point crumbler. And yes, we're pointing out those four, but when you're looking at all the different wheels, are they, to the eye, if you are testing them, to the eye, they look like they're closing pretty well. I mean, most of them are going to close the C-trench, but we would challenge you, what's happening underneath that's not so visual? Is the sidewall getting shattered? Are you avoiding packing, overpacking, soil, the sidewall compaction? Are the wheels, do they have any depth control to them? Or are they getting too deep and possibly dislodging the seeds? So with the Thompson wheels, and again, I'm not trying to make it an infomercial, but if Ethan, yeah, the Thompson wheels, the way they are designed, they're only a 1/4 inch thick. So they're not going to do any packing whatsoever, which is why it's also very important to run a firmer, because you got to get that seed to soil contact. We're keeping loose soil over the top. The way the spokes are spaced and the way they taper off to a flat, abrupt edge gives them that depth control as well. So you're not going to throw seeds out. You're going to simply shatter the sidewall, accomplish that, bring the soil, bring the trench in, and cover it with loose soil over the top. And we also have the bearings that are on the market. We hear a lot about bearing failure, especially if you're going to run it with the toe-out wedge, which, by the way, the toe-out wedges can work with any closing wheel that are out there. But the toe-out wedges are going to put more stress on the closing wheels or on the bearings. And our bearings have a 5-year warranty. They're phenomenal. The claims for our bearings warranties they're minuscule. We rarely ever have any failures.
Another thing I like about the illustration here, the right-hand photo there, is if you would imagine just taking away one of those spike wheels, and again, going back to this half and half setup myth that's out there, putting a solid wheel in the place of a spike wheel, again, you could visualize or just see how, again, you're not addressing sidewall crumbling with a solid wheel. In fact, you're, again, adding more compaction to what's already a sidewall that is very well defined.
Yep. And so here's just a little picture of the Thompson wheels running in the field. You can see this is a pretty good residue. There's a lot of wheat stubble there. But you really can't hardly tell where the Thompson wheels ran, but you can see a little bit. They crumbled up. They pulled some residue back over the furrow. Crusting issues are non-existent here. And it really just, you won't have as many problems doing it this way versus if you're putting a lot of pressure. If you use some row cleaners and you really furrowed these out, you got some clean soil, a lot of those problems are negated here when you have some residue over the furrow, sidewalls are well chopped up, and that's kind of what we're trying to aim for and what we're trying to emphasize. So as I mentioned, there is other double disc opener designs out there. Another popular one is the Case IH Early Riser. And we get this question a lot, you know, why do we feel like it's not as great as the John Deere or Kinsey or White? And there's just a few things that we want to point out that we haven't had good luck with. We've never found them to be ideal in the situation. And for starters, they have this reduced inner diameter gauge wheel, and that's where they have this little pocket that allows the soil to lift as the blade is coming out of the ground. Yes, that may help with some of the sidewall compaction, but as I pointed out earlier in the video and what we've been saying, the sidewall is the only thing that guides the seed to the bottom of the furrow. So if you're allowing some fissures to be created, if you're allowing some soil to get loose on you and fall in ahead of the seed, that's not ideal. The seed may be at an erratic depth, and that's not what you're looking for. So there's no need to do that, especially for a while they were putting these wheels on John Deere planters, and that's especially bad because you can tell Case realizes that it could be a problem. They have this little shoe here to protect the seed tube and help guide that seed to the bottom of the furrow. John Deere planters and Kinsey don't have that, so there's definitely no point in putting an RID wheel on those planters. And then also what I was talking about with making sure the gauge wheel's in the right position, this wheel on the left here, this is planting position. This is as if it was in the ground, and you can see how far forward it is compared to the edge of the blade. So if you envision this blade turning up out of the soil, this soil is going to start falling into the furrow, and there's really no pressure here from the gauge wheel because it's too far forward. It needs to be right as that blade is exiting the soil. That's where the gauge wheel needs to be. And that's one of the other problems we found seeing these run in the field. And then Case does have this offset opener disc. They have a leading edge, and then they have a trailing disc that's a little bit smaller diameter to run in its shadow. That does help with hair pinning because you're just having one edge. But at the same time, when you have offset openers of different diameter, your furrow won't be just perfectly true as if you're running two of the same blade side by side. So to kind of help combat this, it seems like they have, like I said, this little shoe that helps define the furrow. They call it their furrow forming point. And that goes back to what I was saying with the seed tube guards. We don't want anything that does the forming of the furrow. We want the blades to be the only thing that defines the furrow. Anything else is just too much smearing, and it's just unnecessary. And then lastly, their closing system. They have the two twin discs, and then they have that huge packer wheel on the back. They're not fans of a firmer or any type of firming device on the seed. They're saying if you're closing it and then you're packing that soil from the top down, that's going to give you adequate seed to soil contact. And like I pointed out, especially in no-till, but even other conditions, when you're trying to do all that packing from the top down, it's very hard to get rid of all those air pockets and make sure that seed has that seed to soil contact that it needs. It creates a tremendous amount of pressure that you don't need it. If you just run a firmer, you don't have to worry about that. So when you have it packed down from the top, it's that much harder for that seed to poke through the soil. Why waste all that energy trying to get it to go through that when you don't need to? And that's what we're asking. And that's our problems that we see with the Case. And here's just a picture summing up, what we're trying to do. You can see the position of the gauge wheels on the John Deere. Right when this opener blade exits, right here's the gauge wheel to keep that pressure on it, keep that furrow well defined. This is our Valiant seed tube guard. The same spec as an OEM, it's just going to last longer. You won't be changing these guards near as often. And that's what keeps your furrow of the proper width. It keeps your blades from flexing too close together. It's going to protect the seed tube, keep it from cracking. And then we come through with the Keaton seed firmer and we put our Mojo wire on it. That's going to give it enough pressure to force those seeds into the bottom of the furrow and get you that even emergence that we feel is so important. Then we come through with this Thompson wheel. It's our spoked wheel. That's going to chop up the sidewall and loosely cover that seed with dirt. Shouldn't have any problem coming through that. You're not in an over-compacted situation there. And that's what we're trying to summarize.
In addition to what Ethan shared, the other thing I wanted to point out was the Valiant gives us the opportunity, if we choose to deliver an in-furrow product at the bottom of the seed trench ahead of the seed drop. But I also want to point out again where the seed drop is happening in relationship to the blades and the gauge wheel. That seed is dropping at the exact point where gauge wheel pressure is maximized, the most contact with the ground. And like Ethan said, the blade is exiting the ground, and then we're following it up with the Keaton. This is a proven design that has been on the market for quite some time, and it's just consistently works well.
And yeah, so this is your goal. I mean, this is what you're looking for. You know, every seed emerges at the same time. These plants are in the same growth stage. You've got plenty of residue there. You're saving moisture. And as it mentions, this did not have a rain on it, you know, for probably a month after planting. So you should not need a rain to help you get your even stand. If you're planting into moisture, you're planting at the depth where there is moisture, and you're doing the steps correctly, a rain or, you know, those types of conditions should not be needed. You shouldn't have to worry on Mother Nature to help bail you out.
And we have lots of education online. Just to close out the presentation, if you want more details, if you're interested in more details of each step and everything that we've covered, our no-till seeding explained DVD is phenomenal and provides so much knowledge, and it's something that I like to watch every year before planting season gets here. And I hear time and time again from many customers that they do that and they take something away new from it every time. So I'd highly encourage you, if you want to dig deeper, to watch that. And if you're not satisfied, you can send it back to us and we'll give your money back. And then also online, the late Matt Hadney, he had written so many newsletters and on specific topics. And Matt was a perfectionist, extremely detail oriented. And I encourage you to go click around on our website where the newsletters are and read. There's no doubt that it will tremendously impact your farming operation for the better. And lastly, we love to hear from you. Any feedback, any questions about products or seeding, we will shoot straight with you. There's sometimes we don't have a solution for you, but we will find it, or we know someone who does. And we have no problem with recommending other companies that might be able to provide a solution that we cannot meet. And also we have a lot of videos on YouTube for install videos or other webinars that have been recorded. So I also encourage you to check us out on YouTube. So, and if you also that we love to hear from you, if you ever do experience, if you're continually struggling with something with seeding, let us know, because that is what we're about, is finding a solution, and the market may not have a solution for it. And so we will put the resources towards it to provide a solution for our customers. And with that, we can start answering questions. That is the end of the presentation. So the first question we received is, if I run tail-out wedges at a 45-degree angle, and that makes my closing wheels over 2 inches wide on a Kinsey, is that too wide? And my answer is no, it's not. Ideally, the pinch point at the bottom of the closing wheel that's on the ground, that measurement from one spoke to the next, Ideally, you want to get it 2 inches, but Kinsey brackets most of them are too wide, and they will not let you get some of them even more than 2.5 inches. So that's okay. Dale, do you have anything to add?
That's a common question we get, and again, just to go along with what Leah said, usually like to shoot for a window of no closer, no narrower than 1 3/4 inches, and no wider than 2.5 inches. If we can get those points to drop somewhere in that window, you're going to be fine and be able to roll on.
Next question on thoughts on applying starter in bottom of the furrow versus on sidewalls of furrow.
Again, another common question that we get on a regular basis. We're still looking and watching for research to show an agronomic benefit one way or the other, one system over the other, and we're not finding anything that consistently says that one is better, one delivery system. So with that, I would then ask the customer to consider which system is going to be easier for you to install and maintain. There's absolutely nothing wrong with running through the Keaton, but we also see that the benefit and ease of operation of running it through the Valiant and dropping it first ahead of the seed. So either way is going to work fine.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too. On the previous style of Keatons, which would be the universal brackets, Wave Vision, Keaton tails, the way the liquid tubing was routed was not ideal, and it would get pinched a lot. And so it caused a lot of leaking and just frustrations with a lot of customers running it through the Keaton. Now, the newer quick attach Keaton tails are liquid, and the tubing is completely protected, so it eliminates the pinching. So that is a great improvement for Keatons if you used to run it through the Keatons and got very frustrated. And the next question is, it says that was 2 inches between closing wheels or Thompson wheels at the lowest point on the wheel. So yes, this going back to the spacing between one wheel to the next wheel, the spacing, it is the pinch point. And I wish we had a photo on here, and I do have a good photo of where that is, but it is the bottom 2 points of the Thompson wheels. Next question, how do you know what is the ideal amount of row unit down pressure to apply? How do you know if it is too much? What are some problems with too much down pressure? Ethan?
Yep, so dealing with down pressure, like I said, you definitely want to have enough, especially in no-till. I would want to err on the higher side or having too much, because you still have that spoke closing wheel to help chop that up. So even if you do have a little bit of sidewall compaction, you can pretty much take care of that with a spoked wheel. But like I was saying in the video, it's more important to have enough pressure on those wheels to make sure your sidewall is well defined. If you don't have enough, that would almost hurt you more. So unless you're in a pretty wet situation where you know you don't need as much, I would encourage you to err on the high side. And that's just mainly getting out, going in like a wheel track or going through a tougher area of the field, and make sure that you're achieving depth and that there's firm pressure on those gauge wheels. If you're not even doing that in a tough situation, you probably don't have enough down pressure or just frame weight in general, like I was saying with planer weight. So that would be my encouragement, is to make sure just, err on the high side. Don't worry as much of too much, unless you're in a situation where it can be harder to get that closed and to have too much.
Another just in-field way of checking, if you stop with a planter in the ground and go out to your machine, walk up to the gauge wheel, and with your foot, if that gauge wheel spins easy, you probably need more down pressure. If you really have to lean into it and push really hard with your foot to make that gauge wheel move, that's most likely close to optimum. If you cannot budge that gauge wheel at all, you might be a little on the heavy side.
So far, that is all the questions we've received, except someone did ask if this seminar will be made available to access later, and yes, absolutely it will. So we will probably be posting that to YouTube. The only other thing I would like to add, I don't know if Ethan said this or not because I got disconnected for a while, but on the planter blades of keeping them sharp and up to par, some of our top tier customers, Tom Cannon, to name a few, or to name one, he will actually, once he hits 2,000 acres, he will pull his planter out of the field, strip it down, and put brand new blades on. If it gets anywhere close to half of the bevel that is gone, he is replacing those blades mid-season. And just want to emphasize that's how precise, you know, to get optimal seed placement and seed depth and results, it pays off.
And in addition to the blades, I believe Tom also puts on new ketons at that same time as well to make sure
yes,
he's got
does.
a full width keton that's able to do its job.
Yes, he does. So I do not see any attendees that have any hands that are up. If anybody wants to submit any other questions, please do so now. We'll wait a few more minutes before we end the meeting.
I will mention, you know, on that downforce question again, you know, there is a lot of value in the newer systems like the hydraulic downforce that monitors and adjusts automatically. There's a lot of value there because when you're adjusting for the conditions in the field, that definitely will pay off quickly because downforce can make all the difference as far as making sure that seed's at depth. And like I said, with the frame weight and the downforce in general, that's very important. That's where you're making sure that furrow is as deep as it needs to be. You can do the rest right, but if you don't even have a furrow that's going the full 2 inches that you think it is in the certain spots, that's where you can really hinder emergence. So just want to mention that, yes, we definitely feel that it's probably worth it if you're questioning on, you know, some of these downforce monitoring systems, you know, just really tends to help out.
And just kind of a closing comment. Again, this was enjoyable. It was a first for me, but also we just greatly appreciate everyone's involvement, participation, and watching today. We greatly value your business, and also the most important part is this is all being presented to help you succeed. If you don't succeed, we're not going to succeed. We're in this together. So again, it was educational for me, that's for sure. So we appreciate your help.
Absolutely. Appreciate that, Bill. We did get another question. If we have the staff available that will come to a farm to inspect and give recommendations, yes, we will do that. We are a little bit geographically challenged. Ethan is in Indiana, Dale is in Kansas, and I am in Oklahoma. And we are, especially in some of our months that are slower, we would be more than willing to make some trips. So, all right. Thank you, everyone. Like Dale said, we appreciate you, and we will be posting this later on YouTube. Have a good day and stay safe.